I had a couple nice pieces of bird's eye pine sitting around the shop and decided to finally use them for something. So I'm making a window mounted herb garden for the kitchen. And I am epoxy coating the inside so that if something one day spills, which something is guaranteed to spill, it's not going to do any damage to the wood. And also so I have the option of putting dirt directly into the box if I wanted to. I did the first pour of the epoxy last night, and it turned out okay, but it was a little bit bubbly because of the bird's eye figure in the pine. That just absorbs the epoxy differently, and a lot of those are kind of open. So I was getting a lot of bubbles, and I used the normal propane torch and the heat gun approach to work the bubbles out, but maybe because it was inside of those boxes, they were a little bit more challenging to get to. So I decided that maybe it was a good time to do another epoxy solvent test. The last one I did was with 50% acetone and 50% epoxy, and I found that it definitely leveled out a little bit better, and it released the bigger bubbles, but a lot of smaller bubbles remain trapped in the epoxy. I'm just curious if any of these other solvents are going to do any better with helping the epoxy release those bubbles and level out, so there's less work to be done with a propane torch. And definitely not going to use a propane torch this time because these are all some flammable things I got going on here, so don't want to put any heat on that. And I put a link, I think, up in the corner for the acetone video that I did previously, and these are the 4 solvents that I'm going to use. Acetone again, but it's going to be a 25% mix this time, 25% solvent and 75% epoxy. Denatured alcohol, ethanol, set 95% ethanol, probably 5% water. If you don't know the difference between those two, I will also put a link up in the corner to that video. And xylene, which is a petroleum product. I don't know why I have a gallon of xylene in the workshop. I must have bought that a long time ago and probably as an impulse buy. But I got it, and I'm going to use it because it thins epoxy. So we have acetone, 2 types of alcohol, and a petroleum product. And each one is already loaded in one of these syringes. Everything's marked so I don't get them mixed up. And then for the wood samples, I have 4 pieces of ash cut from the same board, and then I have an extra one off to the side there. And I used ash because, first of all, this ash came from a tree that had been dead for a little while, so it's a little bit soft, which means it's going to be a little more absorbent. And it's also pretty porous. Ash has an open grain structure, so that means that the thing that causes bubbles is going to be very present here. The open grain that will allow the epoxy to start to soak in, and the air will try to escape at the same time. So that's what causes those bubbles on the surface. I just wanted to make sure that I made it as prime a situation as possible for bubbles to arise, and then we'll see which one of these solvents does the best in preventing that. I could have added some other solvents in here as well. I was going to use lacquer thinner, but I actually ran out of lacquer thinner and haven't bought any more yet. But since lacquer thinner is a mix of solvents, it's mostly acetone. I think that'll cover that well enough. And then the two different alcohol mixes, largely it's going to be a difference of water. The one on the left is going to evaporate slower, the denatured alcohol, because it has a higher water content, and the one on the right has much lower water content. So I guess let's get started and see how this turns out. I'm going to use 3 pumps of the 105 resin from West Systems and 3 pumps of the 206 hardener, which is a slower drying hardener. And this is going to take about 12 hours for, I think get a little sticky, take about 12 hours for this stuff to cure, so I won't really be able to gauge your results until tomorrow. And I'm going to mix this for about a minute, and then I'll pour it into another cup just to make sure that only the stuff that was thoroughly mixed is included. And then I'll mix it for a little bit more, and then I'll pour it into each one of these cups. And then at that point, once I've made sure that the epoxy and the hardener have are properly mixed together and are starting to react, at that point, that's when I'll add in the solvents. And just want to make sure that everything has a chance to start to react here, because at first the solvent could potentially prevent the epoxy from curing properly, so try to avoid that. But once that happens, as I said, once I get it mixed up, there's probably about a good 10 or 15 minute window where it won't really matter which order I put these in, just because it's going to take about 12 hours for the full cure. So as long as I do everything within 5 or 10 minutes, I don't think it's going to make a difference in the end result. And xylol. Oh boy, and I'm just a little bit short. No, I'm not going to go back and do this again, so I'm going to do a quick transfer. Good to have an extra syringe on hand. Alright, those all look, they're right about at the same level again. Now, I'm going to inject these under the epoxy just because I want to make sure they don't have too much time to evaporate. I got the initial mixing done. Now I'm going to go back and give it a second mix just to make sure. Alright, that one looks pretty good. I'm trying to make sure that my work surface was as level as possible here as well, so it didn't all just run off the side. Try to keep everything contained. Alright, that's denatured alcohol. .95% ethanol. And xylene. And this one is probably the most aromatic and toxic out of all of these. So I'm looking forward to getting out of the garage right now because it's starting to stink in here. But if these are all pretty similar, I think I would definitely go with the least toxic option. But we'll see how it turns out. Let's wait until the morning and we'll have some answers. I almost forgot that this would not be a really good experiment if I didn't have a control piece that was just straight epoxy with nothing else mixed in. That's why I have that fifth piece of wood there. And that one is just plain epoxy with nothing else mixed in. Alright, time to let that sit overnight. It's been a whole whopping 5 minutes since I walked out, but I got curious and wanted to see how things were going, so came in to take a look, and not surprising, the straight epoxy that's not thinned is bubbling like crazy as it soaks into that porous ash. And the xylene is taking a clear lead. That's almost a flawless finish right there. The 95% ethanol is doing pretty good. Just some small bubbles in there. Not as bad as the unthinned, but there's still a couple bubbles. Same thing with the denatured alcohol. I can't really see a major difference between those ones. Maybe a little bit fewer bubbles with the 95% ethanol. And then the acetone is probably about the same as those other two. So far the clear winner is xylene, and I'm kind of curious now to see how well it looks in the morning as far as the hardness and durability of the finish. But that's what we got so far after 5 minutes. It's been about 2 days since I started this experiment, so I think it's a good time to wrap things up. The manufacturer recommends about 12 hours to let the epoxy cure before using it, and it's been 4 times that much, almost, so this should be good enough. This is the unthinned sample. This is just straight epoxy, and as you can see, there are bubbles all over the place. Normally you would use a propane torch to cook those out, or a heat gun, or you could heat the epoxy in advance, but I wanted to do figure out a way to not have to use a torch for, just odd shapes like inside a box. And these bubbles are just from the air coming out of the pores of the wood. I know I stirred it kind of rough when I was putting everything together, so that didn't really help, but most of those bubbles there are from the air coming out of the pores in the wood as the epoxy soaks in. I also have a lot of tiny little craters on the surface there, and I'm not sure if those were from bubbles in the epoxy that popped, or if that was just some kind of result of high moisture levels in the humidity levels in the shop. That might have been it too. Moving on to the xylol or the xylene, same thing. This one had the most bubble-free finish out of all of them, but you can definitely see some ripples in there. It's kind of an orange peel texture, but more sort of a wide orange peel texture, and lots of tiny little very small holes that you can't see from very far away. That was kind of similar to what happened with the acetone on the first experiment, but as far as just like sealing the inside of a box or something, this seems like it would work. The xylene thin finish is also pretty soft still, and I waited an extra day to do this wrap-up video just because the same as the acetone was the first time I did this with a 50-50 mix. This is still pretty soft, very easy to make an indent in it. And with the acetone, it came back to normal after a few more weeks. So this might still harden up as all those all the remaining solvent evaporates. It's still going to be a weaker finish, but again, if you're just trying to seal something, that might work. Just keep in mind that well, this one isn't quite a problem because there aren't any bubbles in the finish, but this is a very flammable product. In fact, all of these are flammable, so you don't want to use the propane torch approach on these. And once again, I was curious, so I did actually test it. I had a scrap piece, and I put some of the alcohol thinned solvent on here with the 95% ethanol. Took it outside to a safe place, hit it with the torch, and immediately I got the little alcohol flame going across the surface. So that'll ruin your epoxy finish pretty quickly if you try to combine alcohol and the torch. Now moving on to the 95% ethanol piece of wood. See, I got a little bit of orange peel in there. It's not quite the ripply orange peel as with the xylol finish. It's a smaller orange peel. And the same thing happened with the denatured alcohol as well. There aren't very many bubbles in there, but there are a couple that didn't quite make it to the surface. Again, this is very porous wood. So even with a thin finish, a lot of that epoxy is soaking down into the pores of the wood, and at some point those air bubbles or the air that's trapped inside those pores is going to try to get back up to the surface. So these probably showed up after it had been curing for a while, but not positive about that. Either way, make sure that you don't hit these with a torch. I'm not sure if thinning it farther with alcohol, adding more alcohol would change this. I'll probably do some more testing with that later. And then moving on to the denatured alcohol, it's about the same with both types of alcohol. Maybe a couple more bubbles in this one, but I can't really say that it's enough of a difference that I would could really say with certainty that it was because of the difference in the two alcohol types. So didn't really seem to change that. These are both about the same hardness, not quite as soft as the xylol. Still a little bit soft though, and I expect that will harden up a little bit more with time. Lastly, we have the acetone finish, and that was pretty close to the same as the first experiment. I got a bunch of tiny little bubbles in the finish, if you can see that. Most of the big bubbles are gone. I don't think there were any really major ones, a couple, but for the most part, the acetone finish was one of the thinner ones. You see it ran off the edge there, and I'll tell you why in just a second. That was kind of unexpected too. And this is also still kind of soft, just like the xylol thin finish. Now, the reason that this ran off the side, all of these had a little bit of stickiness. I had to break that one off. I think these ones just had a few little spots that came through with the alcohol solvent. Didn't really stick too much to the backer I had on there. But one thing that caught me by surprise, you'll see that I had the grain in the same direction, like a smile on all of these, with the inside of the tree facing up. And I just wanted to be consistent with that, just in case it affected anything, you know, if the wood happened to warp in the process. So what happened is that this one stayed flat. Pretty sure that one stayed flat. Yeah, this one stayed flat. The one that was thin with xylene stayed flat. Both of the ones that were thin with alcohol curved. Wait, let me show you. Curved downwards like that. So they cupped with the cup in the middle, and then the acetone thin one did the opposite. This one actually cupped up that way. I don't know if you can see it from an angle, but cupped just a little bit, and I think that's why this puddle ended up over here, is because that stuck first and then this side picked up just a little bit. I'm guessing that the reason that these ones cupped downwards is because the little bit of water that's mixed in with the alcohol caused those wood fibers to expand on the top of the surface, and that would of course make that side of the board curve. And the acetone maybe had an opposite effect. With the acetone getting into the wood fibers, might have helped something evaporate or cause them to shrink. I'm not really sure, but this one definitely curved up, these two definitely curved down, and these ones stayed pretty flat. If that helps with anything in your decision for what solvent to use. So I guess the next thing, I'm not 100% sure that this got me all of the information I wanted, but you know, little by little, you just do experiments until you get where you're trying to get to. I am kind of curious to do a little more with the petroleum products. You have the ketone on the left, the acetone, and then two alcohols in the middle, and the petroleum. But there are some other different petroleum products I might try. Maybe actually just remembered I have some naphtha around here somewhere. Naphtha, mineral spirits, maybe even some odorless mineral spirits, and toluene, just to see if those make a difference in the final product. The mineral spirits is going to be a little bit more oily than the xylene. The xylene is kind of a drier finish, or a drier solvent, but be interesting to see what they do. And then of course playing around with different percentages. So that is, I think, the conclusion of this test. And if you have any information to add to this, please post it down in the comments, or if you have another video to reference, post that in there as well. And I look forward to doing some more testing and hopefully passing on some more useful information. Hope this helps, and have fun. I'm also kind of curious about the long-term effects of putting solvent to the epoxy, so I threw my samples up here behind my miter saw so that I can keep an eye on them over the years. Left them in the same order with the unfinished, the xylene, the 95% ethanol, denatured alcohol, and acetone. Maybe I'll add some more up there later. So if they do anything undesirable like crack or change color, then I'll post an update and let you know. And lastly, because you might be wondering, I decided to go with the 95% ethanol for the solvent for the final coating inside of the boxes, actually on the outside as well. I did closer to a 40% solvent, 60% epoxy mix, and it was a flawless flat finish last night, and by the morning it was pretty ripply, same kind of orange peel on there, except for one spot, and this has me kind of curious. I go all the way back to the beginning here, and you see orange peel, orange peel, orange peel, and then all of a sudden it gets a little bit smoother to the right side. The only thing I can think of that was different in that spot was at one point there was a little piece of fluff in there, and I picked it out with tweezers and then just blew in there to try to see if that would kind of help the surface flow back out around where I picked the piece of fluff out. And as I blew in there, I could see the surface kind of ripple a little bit briefly and then leveled back out. And I'm wondering if just that little bit of air that I put on the surface allowed some alcohol to release from underneath. And maybe that caused that part to be a little bit flatter, less orange peely than the rest of it. I'm not sure, and I guess the only way to figure that out is to do more testing, but once again, that will have to be later. I also just wiped on the outside. I think these just turned out awesome. This is bird's eye pine. That is just crazy, because You know, there's a kind of wood called leopard wood, but this stuff looks more like leopard spots than anything I've ever seen before. So this is kind of cool. But anyway, I just did for the finish on that, I did the same 40% solvent, alcohol to 60% epoxy, and wiped it on, then wiped it off once it's soaked in good enough. Just kind of like an oil finish. So it doesn't really have any build on there like an epoxy normally does, but I wanted to keep the color consistent by using the same finish on the inside and the outside. Might clear coat the outside later, but that is not related directly to epoxy. So I think we'll just wrap this up here. I hope that was helpful. And once again, if you have any additional information to add, please put it in the comments, because me and everybody else watching this would probably like to learn from it. Thank you.